A father's 70th birthday. The grand Sterling family dining room, dripping with old money and secrets. At the head of the table sits Ethan, the millionaire heir, with a beautiful woman on his arm. The only problem? She isn't his wife. He told his real wife, Olivia, that the dinner was cancelled. He told his guest, Katerina, that he was separated. He thought he had orchestrated the perfect deception. But he underestimated one person, the Patriarch himself. In a few moments, his father will stand, raise his glass, and deliver a toast that will not celebrate a life, but detonate one, exposing every lie in a spectacular explosion of truth. The silence in the Greenwich mansion was a physical entity, as heavy and oppressive as the humid Connecticut summer air. It clung to the damask curtains and settled in the deep pile of the Persian rugs. Olivia Sterling had become an expert in navigating this silence, in distinguishing its many textures. There was the tense, brittle silence of Ethan's displeasure, the hollow silence of his absence, and the one she was currently enduring, the humming, electric silence of his lies. It had been building for 6 months. It started as a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a change in pressure that only she, the long-time resident of his world, could detect. Then came the more tangible evidence. The late nights at the office, a classic excuse so threadbare it was insulting. The scent of a perfume that wasn't hers, a heady, musky fragrance called forbidden nectar she'd once smelled on a patron at a charity gala, clinging to the lapels of his Brioni suits. Then there were the phone calls, hushed and urgent, where his voice would drop to a low murmur the moment she entered the room. He'd end them with a clipped, "Asset management. We'll circle back," his eyes avoiding hers. Ethan Sterling, heir to the Sterling Innovations fortune, was a man who believed his intellect and wealth formed an impenetrable shield. He moved through life with the careless confidence of someone who had never faced a real consequence. Their marriage, once a passionate partnership, had slowly devolved into a transactional arrangement. She managed the household, chaired the appropriate charities, and presented the flawless image of a devoted wife, while he expanded the empire his father, Richard, had built. The love had long since eroded, leaving behind a foundation of shared history and social obligation. But loyalty and respect, Olivia believed, should remain. Ethan was bulldozing what little was left. Tonight was supposed to be a cornerstone event, Richard Sterling's 70th birthday dinner. It was a hallowed tradition, an intimate family gathering at the sprawling Sterling estate, a place of genuine warmth that stood in stark contrast to the sterile opulence of her own home. She had been looking forward to it, to the reassuring presence of her father-in-law, a man of quiet integrity who saw more than he ever let on. But yesterday, Ethan had come home early, a rare occurrence. He found her in the walk-in closet, debating between a classic navy Roland Mouret dress and a more contemporary emerald green design. He didn't kiss her hello. He simply leaned against the doorframe, his posture a study in feigned casualness. "Bad news, Liv," he'd said, loosening his tie. "I just got off the phone with Dad. The chef at the estate has come down with a terrible case of norovirus. They're having to postpone the dinner, pushing it to next Saturday." Olivia had turned, the emerald dress in her hand. "Oh no. Is everyone all right?" "Everyone's fine. Just a precaution. Margaret is in a panic, of course. You know how she gets." He gestured vaguely. "Honestly, it might be for the best. You've been looking a bit peaky lately. All those committee meetings. You should take the weekend to rest. Just relax." The lie was so smooth, so practiced, it almost slid past her. But a tiny alarm bell chimed in the back of her mind. The Sterlings didn't use an outside chef for family dinners. Their cook, Mrs. Gable, had been with the family for 40 years and was notoriously robust. Nor a virus. It seemed unlikely, and the look in Ethan's eyes, a flicker of something she couldn't quite name, a mixture of pity and impatience, made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. "Peaky," she repeated, her voice carefully neutral. "I feel perfectly fine." "You're pale," he insisted, walking over and placing a cool hand on her forehead, in a gesture that was meant to be caring, but felt clinical and dismissive. "A little warm, maybe. You deserve a break. I'll have to run into the city tomorrow night anyway. Some last-minute meeting with the Tokyo investors that I can't get out of. So you'll have the whole house to yourself. Order in, watch a movie. My treat." He was not just lying. He was actively constructing an alternate reality for her, walling her off from his real life. He wanted her out of the way. The reason was as clear as the 10-carat diamond on her finger. The dinner wasn't postponed. He was going without her, and he was taking someone else. The realization settled not with a bang, but with a cold, heavy certainty in the pit of her stomach. She had played her part, nodding and expressing her disappointment about the dinner. She allowed him to see what he wanted to see, the compliant, slightly unwell wife who would be tucked away for the weekend. Now, on the night of the dinner, the house was cavernous around her. She had spent the day in a fog of disbelief and mounting fury. Every object in their shared life seemed to mock her. The photograph on the mantelpiece from their wedding 10 years ago. 2 bright young people smiling at a future that had curdled. The expensive art on the walls, chosen for its investment potential, not its beauty. It was all a facade, a gilded cage, and she had only just realized the door had been open all along. She just needed the courage to walk through it. She picked up her phone, her thumb hovering over her father-in-law's number. What would she even say? "I think my husband is cheating on me and is bringing his mistress to your birthday dinner." It sounded hysterical, paranoid. She had no concrete proof, only a deep, gut-wrenching intuition and a web of transparent lies. She needed more. Her phone buzzed, startling her. It was her friend Jessica, a woman with a penchant for high-end retail therapy and gossip. "Olivia, you will not believe who I just saw leaving Cartier on Fifth Avenue. You're Ethan." And he was with a statuesque brunette who looked like she'd just stepped off a runway. He bought her a necklace, Liv. A ridiculously expensive one from the look of the box. "I thought you were with him." The air left Olivia's lungs. Jessica's words were the missing piece, the concrete block that solidified the foundation of her suspicions. It wasn't just a fling. It was a public statement. He was parading this woman around, buying her trinkets from the same stores where he'd once bought Olivia's engagement ring. The disrespect was breathtaking. "No, Jess," Olivia said, her voice eerily calm. "I wasn't with him. He told me he was in a meeting." "Oh, honey," Jessica breathed, the sympathy in her voice making Olivia's skin crawl. After she hung up, Olivia sat motionless for a full 10 minutes. The hurt was a physical ache in her chest, sharp and debilitating. But beneath it, something else was beginning to stir. A cold, hard anger. Richard Sterling valued loyalty and family above the billions in his bank account. He abhorred deceit. Ethan was not just betraying his wife, he was dishonoring his entire family, sullying his father's milestone birthday with a tawdry affair. She stood up, her movements precise and deliberate. She walked back into her closet, past the navy and emerald dresses. She pulled out a simple, elegant black cashmere dress. She slipped on a pair of understated pearl earrings, her wedding ring feeling like a lead weight on her finger. She looked at her reflection in the mirror. The pale, tired woman Ethan had described was gone. In her place was a woman with fire in her eyes. a woman who was done being silent. She grabbed her car keys from the marble bowl by the door. She wasn't going to call. She wasn't going to send a text. She was going to drive to the Sterling estate. She didn't know what she would do when she got there. She only knew she would not spend one more second locked inside this gilded cage. The lie of her life was about to collide with the truth, and she was going to be there to witness the wreckage. Katerina Vance studied her reflection in the gilt-edged mirror of her Upper East Side apartment, the kind of apartment she'd only ever seen in magazines. The rent was astronomical, a figure that would have made her gasp a year ago, but it was paid for, seamlessly, by Ethan. Just like the dress she was wearing. It was a slip of crimson silk by Valentino, a color that made her olive skin and dark hair seem incandescent. Around her neck lay the cool, heavy weight of her newest acquisition, a Cartier love necklace, its diamond-studded circle, a shimmering promise of the life she was about to step into. A year ago, Katerina had been a junior analyst at a rival firm, buried under spreadsheets and fetching coffee, her sharp mind and ambition constrained by a corporate ladder. She was expected to climb one slow rung at a time. Then she'd met Ethan Sterling at a tech conference in Geneva. He hadn't just looked at her. He'd seen her. He'd listened, truly listened, when she spoke about market volatility and emerging tech sectors. He was handsome, powerful, and utterly captivated by her. The affair had started that night, a whirlwind of 5-star hotels, private jets, and a passion that felt like something out of a novel. Ethan had been honest with her from the beginning, or so she believed. "My marriage is a formality, Kat," he'd told her over champagne at Le Bernardin. "Olivia and I are two different people, on two different paths. We stay together for appearances, for the family. It's been over for years. We're in the process of a quiet, amicable separation. It just takes time with this much money involved." She had accepted this. It made sense. In the world Ethan inhabited, marriages were mergers and divorces were complex dissolutions of assets. She saw herself not as a home-wrecker, but as his future. He was breaking free from a cold, loveless past, and she was the vibrant, intelligent partner he deserved. He treated her like a queen, but more importantly, he treated her like an equal. He valued her opinions on business, praised her insights, and promised her a role at Sterling Innovations once the dust settled. 2 nights ago, he had presented her with the invitation. He'd arrived at her apartment with the red Valentino box and the smaller, iconic Cartier one. "I want you to come with me to a dinner on Saturday," he'd said, his blue eyes sparkling with excitement. "It's for my father's 70th birthday. It's time he met you." Katerina had felt a jolt of panic, followed by a wave of elation. "Your father? Ethan, are you sure? With your situation?" "It's the perfect opportunity," he'd insisted, clasping the necklace around her neck, his fingers warm against her skin. "Olivia is away, visiting her sick mother in California. A sudden thing. It's just going to be my parents and my sister. I'll introduce you as a brilliant colleague from our London office, someone I'm mentoring. But my father, he's sharp. He'll see the way I look at you. He'll understand. It's the first step, Kat, the first step to making us official." The story was plausible, the logic sound. It was a soft launch of their relationship. By introducing her in a professional capacity, he could gauge his family's reaction without causing a scandal. It was smart. It was an Ethan move. She trusted him completely, so she had spent the last 48 hours in a state of nervous euphoria. She researched Richard Sterling, reading articles about his legendary business acumen and his deep-seated family values. He was a titan, a self-made man who had turned a small electronics company into a global technology conglomerate. Impressing him was paramount. She and Ethan had rehearsed her cover story, peppering it with details about fabricated projects and market analyses she was supposedly leading. Now, as the black car he had sent for her purred through the streets of Manhattan and headed toward the pristine suburbs of Connecticut, her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. This was the night her life changed, the night she transitioned from a well-kept secret to the future Mrs. Sterling. She smoothed down the silk of her dress and touched the necklace, her good luck charm. The driver turned off the main road and onto a long, winding driveway flanked by ancient oak trees. At the end of it, the Sterling estate emerged, a magnificent stone manor that looked like it had been transported from the English countryside. It was bathed in a warm, golden light, exuding an aura of permanence and power. This was real wealth, not the flashy, transient kind she saw in the city. This was a dynasty. The car crunched to a halt on the gravel courtyard. Before the driver could open her door, Ethan was there, pulling it open himself. He looked impossibly handsome in a tailored navy suit, his smile dazzling. "You look breathtaking," he murmured, his eyes sweeping over her appreciatively as he helped her out of the car. "Absolutely perfect." He squeezed her hand. "Ready?" "As I'll ever be," she whispered, allowing him to lead her up the stone steps to the massive oak doors. The moment they stepped inside, she felt as if she had entered another world. The foyer was vast, with a soaring ceiling, a sweeping staircase, and walls adorned with ancestral portraits whose eyes seemed to follow her. An older man in a crisp uniform, whom Ethan introduced as Mr. Abernathy, took her coat with a polite but inscrutable expression. Ethan led her toward a large drawing room from which the low murmur of conversation and the clinking of glasses emanated. "Just relax," he whispered in her ear. "Be yourself. They're going to love you." Her confidence wavered for a fraction of a second. She was an outsider here, a girl from a middle-class family in Ohio who had clawed her way to this moment. The sheer, unadulterated weight of the Sterling legacy was intimidating. But then she caught her reflection in a hallway mirror. The crimson dress, the diamond necklace, the powerful man with his hand possessively on the small of her back. She belonged here. Ethan had chosen her. She took a deep breath, composed her features into a mask of serene confidence, and stepped into the lion's den. The drawing room was exactly as Katerina had imagined it, only more so. A fire crackled in a cavernous stone fireplace, despite the summer heat, more for ambiance than necessity. The furniture was a collection of rich velvets and worn leather, pieces that looked like they had been in the family for generations. Standing by the mantelpiece, holding a glass of what looked like single malt scotch, was Richard Sterling. He was not a tall man, but he possessed a gravitational pull that made him the undeniable center of the room. His hair was a thick mane of silver, and his eyes, a paler blue than his son's, were sharp and intelligent. They missed nothing. As Ethan made the introductions, Richard's gaze swept over Katerina, polite but analytical, like a master jeweler assessing a stone. "Father, this is Katerina Vance," Ethan announced, his tone a little too loud, a little too jovial. "Katerina is one of our brightest rising stars from the European division. She's in town for the quarterly review, and I thought it was a perfect chance for her to meet the family." "Miss Vance," Richard said, his voice a low, pleasant baritone. He extended a hand. His grip was firm, his skin dry and cool. "It's a pleasure to have you in our home. Sterling Innovations is always proud of its exceptional talent." The compliment was perfectly delivered, yet Katerina felt a subtle probe within the words. Talent. He was placing her firmly in a professional box. "The pleasure is all mine, Mr. Sterling. I've admired your work for years. Your strategies on market diversification in the early 2000s are legendary." She had rehearsed the line, and it came out smoothly. Richard offered a small, knowing smile. "It's always a good sign when our people study the company's history. It shows commitment." A woman with soft, elegant features and kind eyes detached herself from a nearby armchair. This was Margaret Sterling, Ethan's mother. She greeted Katerina with a genuine warmth that was a stark contrast to her husband's reserved appraisal. "Katerina, how lovely to meet you. You must tell us all about London. I do hope Ethan is being a proper host." "He's been wonderful, Mrs. Sterling," Katerina said, feeling a bit of her tension ease. But her relief was short-lived. A younger woman who had been watching the entire exchange in silence from a wing-back chair rose to her feet. She had Ethan's dark hair, but Richard's piercing blue eyes. This had to be the sister, Caroline. "Caroline, this is Katerina Vance," Ethan said. Caroline's handshake was brief and cool. Her smile did not reach her eyes. "Vance," she said, her tone flat. "I don't believe I've heard Ethan mention you before, and he mentions everyone he deems important." The jab was subtle but landed with precision. Ethan laughed it off. "Caro, you know I can't keep you briefed on every single one of our top executives. Katerina's work has been instrumental in our fintech expansion." "I see," Caroline said, her eyes drifting down to the Cartier necklace sparkling at Katerina's throat before flicking back up to her face. "Quite an instrument." An awkward silence descended. Katerina felt a flush of heat creep up her neck. Caroline's hostility was palpable. She clearly didn't believe the colleague story for a second. Was it that obvious? Or was she just naturally protective of her brother's marriage? The thought of Olivia, the faceless, absent wife, pricked at her conscience for the first time. She pushed it away. Ethan had said the marriage was over. Caroline was probably just loyal to a fault and hadn't accepted the reality of the situation yet. Richard, ever the master of social dynamics, stepped smoothly into the breach. "Well, I'm famished," he declared. "Margaret, shall we move to the dining room? Miss Vance, I trust you'll find Mrs. Gables cooking a welcome change from London's restaurant scene." He led the way, with Margaret on his arm. Ethan placed his hand on Katerina's back again, a gesture of reassurance, but she could feel the tension in his fingers. He was nervous. The realization unsettled her. The unflappable Ethan Sterling was on edge in his own family home. The dining room was even more magnificent than the drawing room. A long mahogany table, polished to a mirror shine, was set with heirloom silver and crystal that glittered under the light of a massive chandelier. The four of them took their seats, with Richard at the head of the table and Ethan at the foot. Margaret sat to her husband's right, placing Katerina directly opposite Caroline, whose cool, appraising stare was relentless. The first course was served by Mr. Abernathy, a delicate lobster bisque. The conversation was stilted, a carefully choreographed dance around the obvious. They talked about the weather, about European politics, about a recent acquisition by Sterling Innovations. Katerina did her best to contribute intelligently, drawing on the business articles she'd devoured and the talking points Ethan had fed her. Richard seemed to listen intently, nodding occasionally. "Ethan tells me you were the architect of the Helvetia project," he remarked, dabbing his mouth with a linen napkin. "A very aggressive and successful push into the Swiss digital banking market." "I was part of a larger team, of course," Katerina said modestly, "but I was proud to lead the strategy on user acquisition." This was one of the key elements of her cover story. "Fascinating," Richard said, his eyes twinkling in a way that seemed both curious and dangerous. "I was under the impression that was spearheaded by Robert Ackerley. I had lunch with him in Zurich last month. A brilliant fellow. He never mentioned your name." The blood drained from Katerina's face. It felt like the floor had dropped out from under her. It was a direct hit, a test she hadn't prepared for. She looked to Ethan for help, but he was suddenly engrossed in swirling the wine in his glass, his jaw tight. She scrambled for an answer, her mind racing. "Mr. Ackerley is the overall head of the division, of course," she managed, her voice a little too high. "He operates at the 30,000-foot level. I was on the ground, leading the tactical implementation. We didn't interact directly." It was a weak recovery, and she knew it. Caroline let out a barely audible scoff. Richard didn't press the point. He simply nodded slowly, a thoughtful expression on his face, and changed the subject. "Well, it's a competitive world. It takes a certain kind of person to thrive in it, someone willing to take risks, to be bold." He looked from Katerina to his son. "Wouldn't you agree, Ethan?" Ethan finally looked up, a forced smile plastered on his face. "Absolutely, father. Boldness is the sterling way." Katerina took a sip of water, her hand trembling slightly. This was not a friendly family dinner. It was an interrogation. Richard Sterling was not just making conversation. He was gathering information, testing for weaknesses in her story. And Caroline was his silent, hostile accomplice. She suddenly felt very alone, a pawn in a game whose rules she didn't fully understand. The beautiful crimson dress felt like a costume, and the diamond necklace a brand. She glanced at Ethan, hoping for a sign of solidarity, but he refused to meet her gaze. He was too busy trying to survive in the den of the lion he called a father. As Mr. Abernathy cleared away the bisque bowls and served the main course, a perfectly roasted rack of lamb, an oppressive silence settled over the table. It was broken only by the clink of silverware against porcelain. Katerina tried to eat, but the food tasted like ash in her mouth. Every bite felt like a performance, every movement scrutinized by Richard's analytical gaze and Caroline's open contempt. Ethan, sensing the disastrous turn the evening was taking, attempted to seize control of the narrative. He launched into a monologue about a new AI venture capital fund he was starting, his voice filled with a forced, booming enthusiasm that sounded hollow in the grand dining room. He was performing for his father, trying to project the image of the competent, visionary heir. "And the scalability is immense, father. We're talking about a potential 10-fold return within 5 years. The seed funding is already in place," Ethan boasted, gesturing with his wine glass. Richard listened patiently, his expression unreadable. When Ethan finished, he simply said, "Ambitious, but high risk. You'll need to watch your exposure." It was not a word of praise, but a quiet caution, the kind one gives to a reckless child. The comment seemed to deflate Ethan, who retreated into a sulky silence. It was Margaret who, in her gentle way, tried to salvage the evening. "Katerina, Ethan mentioned you do a great deal of traveling for the company. You must have some wonderful stories. Have you been anywhere exciting recently?" Katerina saw it as a lifeline, a chance to steer the conversation to safer, more personal ground. "Oh yes, it's one of the perks of the job," she said, forcing a bright smile. "We just closed a deal in the Caribbean. I spent a week in St. Bart's last month. The weather was divine." She said it innocently, a throwaway line meant to be pleasant. But as soon as the words left her mouth, she felt the atmosphere shift. Caroline, who had been pushing a single pea around her plate, suddenly looked up, her eyes narrowed into slits. "St. Bart's," Caroline repeated, her voice laced with a strange intensity. "Last month? That's fascinating. Olivia was supposed to go to St. Bart's with Ethan last month for their anniversary, but she had to cancel at the last minute because her mother took a fall. Ethan said he cancelled the trip entirely. He told us he spent the week buried in paperwork at the office. The silence that followed was absolute. Katerina's heart stopped. She stared at Caroline, then her eyes darted to Ethan, whose face had gone pale. He had told Katerina the trip was a company retreat for top performers. Another lie. A stupid, reckless, easily discoverable lie. He had taken his mistress on the vacation he was supposed to have with his wife. The audacity of it, the sheer, arrogant carelessness, was staggering. It must have been a different trip, Katerina stammered, the blood roaring in her ears. A different time. My project was for the fintech division. How strange, Caroline mused, her voice dripping with faux innocence. 2 major concurrent company trips to the same tiny island. Sterling Innovations must own half the hotels there. She took a delicate sip of her wine, her eyes never leaving Katerina's face. The trap had been sprung. Meanwhile, 50 miles away, Olivia was pulling her Mercedes through the familiar gates of the Sterling estate. She hadn't called ahead. She hadn't warned anyone. The raw, visceral need to confront the lie had propelled her forward, driving on pure adrenaline and a sense of righteous fury. After her friend Jessica's call, she had felt a strange clarity. The years of quiet unhappiness, of sublimating her own needs for the sake of Ethan's career and their public image, had coalesced into a single point of action. She didn't use the main entrance. She drove around to the service road that led to the kitchens, parking her car in the shadows by the greenhouse. She knew the layout of the house as well as her own. A small, rarely used door from the west garden led into the library, which adjoined the main dining room. Her hands were shaking as she inserted the old brass key, a key she hadn't used in years, into the lock. It turned with a quiet click. She slipped inside, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the thick oriental rug. The library was dark, smelling of old paper and leather. Through the thick, carved double doors that led to the dining room, she could hear the faint murmur of voices. She crept closer, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She pressed her ear to the cold, polished wood. The voices became clearer. She could hear Caroline's sharp, incisive tone, and a lighter, feminine voice she didn't recognize, the voice of the other woman. And then she heard the lie about St. Bart's unravel. Ethan said he cancelled the trip entirely, Caroline was saying. Olivia squeezed her eyes shut. The confirmation was a physical blow, knocking the wind out of her. It was real, it was all real. He had taken that woman to their anniversary spot. The cruelty was almost incomprehensible. Tears of anger and betrayal pricked at her eyes, but she willed them away. This was not the time for weakness. She heard the unfamiliar voice stammer a pathetic defense. Then she heard Ethan's, strained and angry. "Caroline, that's enough. You're making our guest uncomfortable. Let's drop it." A deeper voice cut through the tension, calm and authoritative. "Richards, no. I think your sister raises an interesting point about transparency." Olivia's hand went to the ornate brass handle of the library door. Her mind was a whirlwind. What was she doing? Was she really about to storm into a family dinner and cause a scene of unimaginable proportions? Part of her screamed to turn back, to flee into the night, and deal with this messy, humiliating disaster in private. But another part, a part she hadn't heard from in a very long time, urged her forward. It was the part of her that still believed in the sanctity of family, in the ideals of respect and honor that her father-in-law embodied. Ethan had brought this disgrace into his father's home on his father's birthday. This was not just an attack on her, it was an attack on everything Richard held dear. He deserved to know the truth. They all did. She took a deep breath, the cool air of the library steadying her nerves. Her hesitation evaporated, replaced by a steely resolve. She was no longer just Ethan Sterling's wife. She was Olivia Sterling, and she would not be dismissed, discarded, and lied to. She was not a problem to be managed or a detail to be hidden away. She was a person, a member of this family, and she was walking into that room. With her shoulders back and her head held high, she turned the handle and pushed the door open. The library door swung inward with a soft, expensive sigh, revealing the scene in the dining room as if it were a tableau on a stage. For a moment, no one noticed her. All eyes were locked in the tense standoff at the table. Then, Margaret Sterling, who was seated facing the library, gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "Olivia!" Every head whipped around. The collective shock was a palpable wave that rolled through the room. There stood Olivia, framed in the dark wood of the doorway, a spectre at the feast. She wasn't dressed for a party. Her simple black dress and pale, determined face stood in stark contrast to the festive setting. Ethan was the first to recover, his face a mask of disbelief, quickly morphing into controlled fury. He shot up from his chair, knocking his wine glass, which wobbled precariously before settling. "Olivia! My God, darling, you startled us. I thought you were at home resting." He rushed toward her, his movements jerky and unnatural. "What a wonderful surprise. Are you feeling better?" He tried to take her arm, to steer her away, to absorb her into his narrative and control the damage. But Olivia stood her ground, pulling her arm away from his touch as if it were a hot iron. "I was feeling unwell, Ethan," she said, her voice quiet, but carrying to every corner of the silent room. "But I'm feeling much clearer now." Her gaze swept past her husband's frantic face and landed on the woman sitting in her usual seat. Katerina Vance stared back, her face ashen. The confident, brilliant colleague had vanished, replaced by a woman drowning in a nightmare. The crimson dress now looked garish, the diamond necklace a brand of shame. In that instant, Katerina understood everything. The absent wife wasn't away in California, the marriage wasn't over, and she was not a respected colleague. She was the tawdry secret, dragged into the light and put on display for the family she had hoped to impress. A wave of humiliation so intense it made her physically nauseous washed over her. Caroline watched the scene with a look of grim vindication, while Margaret looked back and forth between Olivia and Ethan, her expression one of dawning horror and confusion. But it was Richard Sterling who commanded the room, even in his stillness. He had not moved from his seat at the head of the table. He simply observed, his face a granite mask, his pale blue eyes taking in his son's panic, his daughter-in-law's steely resolve, and the utter desolation on Katerina Vance's face. He looked at Olivia, and for the first time that evening, his expression softened with something that looked like profound sorrow and respect. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Ethan, stop hovering over your wife," Richard said, his voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "Let her come in. Olivia, you look like you could use a drink. Abernathy, please fetch a glass for Mrs. Sterling." The calm, procedural command shattered Ethan's composure. "Father, this is just a misunderstanding," he sputtered, gesturing wildly between the two women. "Olivia, Katerina is a colleague, I swear. This is a business dinner. I told you I had a meeting with investors." "You told me," Olivia interrupted, her voice gaining strength, "that this dinner was postponed. You told me Mrs. Gable had norovirus. You told me to stay home and rest because I looked peaky." She recited his lies back to him, each one a perfectly aimed dart. Ethan flinched, his bravado crumbling. He had no defense. He was caught, tangled in the web of his own deceptions in front of the one person whose approval he craved above all others. Katerina, seeing her entire imagined future disintegrate, finally found her voice. It was a choked whisper. "He told me you were separated," she said, looking at Olivia, her eyes pleading for some kind of understanding. "He said you were visiting your sick mother." The two lies, spoken by the two women he had deceived, hung in the air, creating a devastating harmony of his betrayal. Ethan stared, cornered and exposed, his face contorting in a rictus of fury. "Both of you, be quiet," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. He was losing control, the polished facade cracking to reveal the ugly desperation beneath. "No, son," Richard Sterling said, his voice quiet but imbued with an absolute, unshakable authority. He slowly pushed his chair back and rose to his feet. He picked up his champagne flute, the one intended for his birthday toast. The simple action silenced everyone. Mr. Abernathy, who had returned with a glass for Olivia, froze by the sideboard, a silent witness to the unfolding drama. "I believe," Richard said, his eyes scanning the faces at the table, lingering for a moment on his son, "that it is time for my toast." The air grew thick with dread. This was not going to be a celebratory speech. It was going to be a reckoning. Ethan looked at his father, a dawning terror in his eyes, as if he were a condemned man watching the judge put on the black cap. Olivia stood tall, her presence having set the stage for the final act. She had come seeking the truth, and now it seemed the family patriarch himself was about to deliver it. Richard Sterling held the champagne flute aloft, the pale gold liquid shimmering under the chandelier's light. The room was so quiet that the tiny bubbles fizzing in the glass seemed to roar. He surveyed the scene before him. His son, pale and cornered, his daughter-in-law, standing with the quiet dignity of the wronged, his wife, her face a canvas of confusion and pain, and the young woman, Katerina, who looked as if she wished the ground would swallow her whole. 70 years, Richard began, his voice calm and measured, resonating with the patriarchal authority he so rarely brandished. "It's a significant milestone, a time for reflection, a time to look back on what one has built. Not just a company, not just wealth, but a name, a legacy." He paused, letting the weight of the word legacy settle into the room. He turned his gaze slowly until it rested fully on Ethan. A legacy is not built on spreadsheets or stock prices. It's built on stronger materials, on integrity, loyalty, and honor. It's about the promises you keep, especially the ones you make to your family. It's about protecting your name, not just for yourself, but for the generations that come after you. Ethan shifted in his seat, a muscle twitching in his jaw. "Father, perhaps this isn't the time." "This is precisely the time," Richard cut him off, his voice hardening ever so slightly. "Because tonight I have been given a gift, the gift of clarity. So I would like to propose a toast to the truth." He took a slow, deliberate sip of champagne, his eyes never leaving his son. "Let us toast," he continued, setting his glass down with a soft click. "To my son, Ethan, a man of bold initiatives." He picked up a small, leather-bound folder that had been sitting beside his plate, unnoticed until now. He opened it. He is so dedicated to his work that he established a private, unlisted credit account with Amex for client entertainment, an account with a staggering expenditure over the last 6 months. For instance, a charge for 2 first-class tickets to St. Bart's last month at a cost of $22,000, and a week-long booking at the Eden Rock Presidential Villa, a very expensive business meeting. Katerina let out a small, strangled sob. Olivia stood like a statue, her expression unmoving, but her hands were clenched into tight fists at her sides. Richard flipped a page in the folder. Let's also toast to his generosity. A generosity so profound that he signed a 1-year lease on a 2-bedroom apartment at 740 Park Avenue. Not as a corporate asset, mind you, but a personal lease, paid for through a shell corporation. A lovely little nest, I'm sure. The monthly rent alone would cover a junior analyst's salary for a year. He looked directly at Katerina now, his expression not unkind, but piercingly direct, and a toast to his exquisite taste in jewelry. So exquisite, in fact, that he purchased a Cartier Love necklace just yesterday afternoon. The receipt is right here. He paid for it with the same private Amex. A beautiful piece. His eyes flickered to the necklace at Katerina's throat. It seems he couldn't wait to give it to his rising star from the European division. Katerina's hand instinctively flew to her neck, her fingers touching the cold, diamond-studded metal. It felt like a slave collar. Tears streamed down her face, silently tracing paths through her perfect makeup. She had been bought and paid for, and the price tag was being read aloud for all to hear. But perhaps the most impressive feat, Richard went on, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl, is his mastery of logistics and deception. It takes a special kind of mind to orchestrate a lie of this magnitude. To tell his wife, Olivia. He turned his gaze to her, and this time it was filled with warmth and deep apology. A woman of grace and intelligence who has been a true daughter to me, that my birthday dinner was cancelled. To invent a story about a sick cook to ensure she would be at home, out of the way, while he brought his guest into this house. He slammed the folder shut. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. You did not bring a colleague to my home tonight, Ethan. You brought your mistress. You did not come here to celebrate my life. You came to desecrate the principles upon which it was built. You have lied to your wife. You have lied to this young woman. You have lied to your mother, your sister, and to me. You have shown a staggering disrespect, not for our rules, but for our family. You have valued a tawdry, fleeting affair over decades of loyalty and love. You have sullied the sterling name under my own roof, on my own birthday. Each sentence was a hammer blow, systematically dismantling Ethan's world. Ethan, stripped of all his bluster, could only stare at his father, his face a mottled canvas of shame and impotent rage. So yes, Richard concluded, picking up his glass again, a toast to the truth. For it is ugly and it is painful, but it is the only foundation upon which anything of value can be rebuilt. He paused, his eyes sweeping the room one last time, or in some cases, demolished. He drained his glass in one swallow and set it down on the table with a final, definitive thud. The sound sealed Ethan's fate. The toast was over. The truth was out. And the Sterling family, as they knew it, was irrevocably shattered. The silence that followed Richard's toast was heavier and more profound than any that had come before. It was the silence of a battlefield after the final shot has been fired. The destruction was total. Ethan was the first to break. He surged to his feet, his chair screeching back against the hardwood floor. His face was flushed with a furious, desperate energy. "How dare you?" he spat at his father, his voice cracking. "How dare you humiliate me in my own home? In your home? You hired a private investigator? You spied on me? On your own son?" Richard didn't flinch. He met his son's rage with an icy calm that was far more terrifying. "When a cancer grows in a body, you don't ignore it. You cut it out," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "You ceased to be just my son and became a threat to the integrity of this family and our name. I acted accordingly." "This is about Olivia, isn't it?" Ethan sneered, turning his venom on her. "You ran crying to Daddy, didn't you? You couldn't handle your own marriage, so you had him fight your battles for you." Before Olivia could even respond, Caroline stood up. "She didn't have to," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "We all saw it, Ethan. We saw you. We just didn't want to believe it. But you couldn't help yourself, could you? You had to be this arrogant. You had to rub our faces in it." The family was turning on him, a united front of disgust and disappointment. He was alone. His eyes darted to Katerina, perhaps seeking an ally, a fellow victim. But Katerina was already on her feet, gathering the shreds of her dignity. She looked at him with eyes full of a new, terrible clarity. She saw him not as a charming, powerful savior, but as a weak, deceitful man who had used her as a prop in his pathetic psychodrama. "You lied to me," she whispered, her voice trembling but clear. "You used me." Without another word, she turned and walked, almost ran, from the dining room, her crimson dress a slash of colour disappearing into the shadows of the grand house. The sound of the front door opening and closing a moment later was her final punctuation. Ethan was now a general with no army, a king with no subjects. He looked at his father, his fury collapsing into a desperate plea. "Father, please." "There is nothing to discuss tonight," Richard said, his tone final. "Mr. Abernathy will show you to a guest room. You will not be returning to the Greenwich house. Tomorrow morning, at 9 a.m., you will meet me at the office. With my lawyers. Your leadership position at Sterling Innovations is terminated, effective immediately. We will discuss the terms of your severance from the company and your disinheritance from the family trust." The words disinheritance from the family trust hung in the air, a death sentence to the life Ethan had always known. It was not just about the money, it was about the identity, the power, the very core of who he was. "You can't," Ethan breathed, shaking his head in disbelief. "You can't do that." "I can," Richard stated simply, "and I will. You are my son, and I will always lament the man you failed to become. But you are not a Sterling in character, and that is a failure I will not tolerate." He turned his back on Ethan, a gesture of ultimate dismissal, and walked to Olivia. He gently took her hands in his. They were ice cold. "Olivia," he said, his voice now filled with a deep, paternal kindness. "I am so profoundly sorry. Sorry for my son's weakness, and sorry that you were hurt so badly under my roof. This house is your home. It will always be your home. The Sterling family stands with you, unconditionally." Tears she had refused to shed in front of Ethan now welled in Olivia's eyes, not tears of pain, but of gratitude and release. In the midst of the worst night of her life, she had found an anchor. She had found her family. 6 months later, the conference room at the Sterling Philanthropic Foundation was bright and airy, overlooking the bustling streets of Manhattan. Olivia stood at the head of the table, confidently outlining a new initiative for funding STEM education in underserved communities. She was no longer just Olivia Sterling, the society wife. She was the foundation's new executive director, a position she had earned through her sharp intellect and a newfound passion Richard had encouraged her to pursue. Her divorce from Ethan had been swift and surprisingly clean. Stripped of the family trust and his executive power, Ethan had little leverage. He had taken a modest settlement and disappeared, reportedly living in Singapore, trying to leverage what was left of his name to start a new venture. No one in the family had heard from him directly. Katerina Vance had also vanished from their world. A week after the disastrous dinner, she had sent a short, handwritten note to Olivia's lawyer. It contained a simple, sincere apology and the Cartier necklace. Olivia had immediately sold it, donating the entire sum to a shelter for women. The Sterling family had been reshaped by the fire of that night. Margaret and Richard were closer than ever, their bond forged anew in the crisis. Caroline and Olivia had developed a deep friendship, a sisterhood born of shared loyalty. The family dinners at the estate continued, but they were different now, smaller, quieter, and filled with an honesty that had been absent for years. The legacy Richard had spoken of was being redefined. It was no longer just about corporate power and immense wealth. It was about resilience, integrity, and the strength to excise the parts that threatened to corrupt the whole. Olivia, once trapped in a gilded cage, had found her freedom, not by leaving the family, but by helping to rebuild it on a foundation of truth. She had lost a husband, but she had gained herself, and in doing so had secured her true place in the Sterling legacy. And that's how a single birthday toast became a weapon of truth, dismantling a web of lies and deceit in one unforgettable night. Ethan Sterling thought his money and power made him untouchable, but he forgot that true strength lies in character, not in a bank account. Olivia's courage to confront the lie and Richard's refusal to tolerate dishonor saved more than just a family's reputation. It redefined their very legacy. What do you think? Was Richard's public takedown of his own son justified, or should he have handled it in private? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. If this story of betrayal and ultimate justice resonated with you, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with someone who loves a good story, and make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell. We have more incredible real-life dramas coming your way that you won't want to miss.